The storm that changed everything. The city was drowning in a storm. Icy rain lashed against the towering skyscrapers, turning the streets into slick mirrors of neon light. Wind howled between the buildings, rattling windows, and bending the few pedestrians who dared to venture out against its merciless push. Nathaniel Kane adjusted the cuffs of his tailored coat as he stepped out from the marble and glass fortress of Kane Enterprises. His company, his empire, built on discipline, numbers, and unshakable control. The merger he just finalized had taken hours longer than expected, but that was the price of dominance. The billion-dollar deal sealed before midnight. The world should have felt firmly in his grip. Instead, he felt a strange unease prick at the edges of his thoughts. "Sir," his driver, Maxwell, called from the car, a sleek black Mercedes parked across the lot. He held an umbrella, standing at perfect attention, despite the wind that tried to rip it from his grip. Nathaniel nodded and stepped forward, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the rain-soaked pavement. That was when he heard it. A sob. Small. Desperate. A sound so fragile it nearly got swallowed by the storm. Nathaniel stopped mid-step, turning toward a narrow alley between two towering buildings. The shadows there were thick, made deeper by the glow of a flickering street lamp just beyond. A child's cry. He hesitated, every logical fiber of his mind telling him to ignore it. It wasn't his concern. He was no savior, no hero. His world was built on deals and figures, not this. Yet his feet moved anyway. The further into the alley he stepped, the worse the scene became. Cardboard boxes lay crumpled against a graffiti-covered wall. Trash bags torn open by rats spilled onto the wet ground. And then, beneath the dim light filtering from a distant window, he saw her. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7. Barefoot, soaked through, knees hugged to her chest as she huddled against the wall, trembling violently. Her dark curls clung to her pale face, water dripping from her nose. Her thin dress, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a rag clinging to her frail frame. Purple bruises ringed her wrists. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat. She was so small, so broken. Then, as if sensing his presence, she lifted her head. Her eyes, huge, dark, terrified, locked onto his. A storm of emotions raged in them. Fear, pain, and something else. Something fragile. Hope. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. Nathaniel knelt, ignoring the cold that seeped through his expensive slacks. He reached into his coat, ready to offer her warmth, to take her somewhere safe. When a sharp laugh sliced through the storm. "Well, well, look what we have here." Nathaniel's body went rigid as 3 men emerged from the alley's shadows. Their movements were slow, practiced, like predators closing in on cornered prey. The leader stepped forward first, a thick, scarred face twisted into an amused smirk. His hands were shoved into the pockets of a leather jacket, but Nathaniel could tell he was armed. "This ain't your problem, big shot," the man drawled, tilting his head. "Walk away." Nathaniel didn't move. The girl's small fingers clutched at his sleeve now, her grip weak but desperate. The scared man's eyes flicked to her, then back to Nathaniel. "She's ours." A sick feeling curled in Nathaniel's gut. His mind worked fast. The girl, the bruises, the fear in her eyes. They weren't random thugs. They weren't here by accident. They were here for her. The man took another step forward, the sick amusement never leaving his expression. "Now you look like a smart man," he continued. "You know how things work. This little street rat." He nodded toward the girl. "She doesn't belong to you. She belongs to us." Nathaniel clenched his fists. He was used to threats. In the business world, men played games of power and intimidation. But this was something else. This was darkness, unfiltered and raw. The girl trembled harder against him. "Hand her over," the man said, voice sharper now. We'll pretend this never happened." Nathaniel exhaled slowly, schooling his expression into the same unreadable mask he wore in corporate battles. "No." Silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The man's smirk disappeared. A flick of his wrist. The two men behind him moved instantly. Nathaniel barely had time to react before the first attacker lunged, aiming a punch for his ribs. Years of training took over. Nathaniel sidestepped, catching the man's wrist midair, twisting sharply. A sickening crack rang out as the thug yelped in pain, stumbling backward. The second attacker reached for something in his jacket, probably a knife. Nathaniel didn't give him the chance. He surged forward, slamming his palm into the man's chin with brutal precision. The thug's head snapped back, and he crumpled to the ground, dazed. The leader growled in frustration. "Rich bastard thinks he can play hero." Nathaniel kept his stance firm, his breath steady. His eyes flicked toward the little girl, her arms still locked around his sleeve, wide-eyed with terror. He had to get her out of here. The scared man exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "You just bought yourself a world of trouble," he muttered. Then he smirked again and whistled. From the far end of the alley, footsteps echoed. More of them. Nathaniel's pulse hammered as 3 more figures stepped from the shadows, blocking their exit. This was bad. The leader chuckled, cracking his knuckles. "Tough guy," he mused. "Let's see how tough you are when we break you." The girl whimpered, burying her face against Nathaniel's coat. He took a slow, steady breath. He had 2 choices: fight or die protecting her. Nathaniel Kane had never lost a battle in his life. He wasn't about to start now. A battle worth fighting. The world outside the alley faded. Nathaniel's pulse pounded in his ears, his senses narrowing to a singular focus. The trembling little girl clinging to his coat, and the 6 men closing in on them. The air was thick with rain, the alley's walls pressing in, shadows stretching like grasping fingers. The leader, the one with the scared face, watched him with amusement, his cruel smirk deepening as he cracked his knuckles. "You really want to die for some street trash, big shot?" he sneered. Nathaniel ignored him. He shifted slightly, positioning himself between the girl and the advancing thugs, scanning for weaknesses. Every good business deal, every hostile takeover, success was always about strategy, calculating risk, exploiting openings. And right now, this was no boardroom. This was survival. One of the thugs lunged first, swinging wildly. Nathaniel pivoted smoothly, his footwork precise, and let the attacker's momentum carry him past. The second Nathaniel saw the man's weight shift off balance. He drove his elbow into the thug's ribs. Hard. The air left the man's lungs in a wheeze as he crumpled to the wet pavement, gasping. Another thug was already closing in. A flash of metal. A knife. Nathaniel barely had time to react before the blade swiped toward him. He jerked back, feeling the sting of fabric tearing as the tip of the knife sliced the edge of his coat. No hesitation. No wasted movement. He grabbed the thug's wrist in a vice grip, twisting sharply until bones popped. The man screamed. The knife clattered to the ground. Nathaniel kicked it out of reach and used his momentum to drive the attacker face first into the alley wall. 2 down. The third came next, bigger than the others. He barreled forward like a linebacker, aiming to tackle Nathaniel to the ground. A low move. A smart move. Because if they could pin him down, if they could separate him from the girl, it was over. Nathaniel braced himself, adjusting his stance in a fraction of a second. As the thug crashed into him, Nathaniel didn't resist. He moved with it, letting the force carry them both backward. But instead of falling, he twisted, using the thug's own momentum against him, flipping the man onto his back with a brutal impact that sent water splashing across the pavement. Nathaniel stepped back, breathing hard. The scared leader's smirk had disappeared. "Persistent little bastard, ain't you?" he muttered. He pulled something from inside his jacket. Nathaniel's stomach clenched. A gun. A slow click echoed through the alley as the leader cocked the hammer, the metal gleaming under the flickering streetlight. "This is where you back down, rich boy," he said, voice smooth, almost amused. "You got skill, but skill won't stop a bullet." Nathaniel's muscles coiled, every instinct screaming at him to move. But the girl, she was still behind him, clinging to his leg, shaking violently. He couldn't leave her exposed, couldn't risk her life. The leader saw the hesitation, and his smirk returned. "That's what I thought." Nathaniel's mind raced. He needed a distraction, needed a way to close the gap before. A deep honk split the night. Headlights flooded the alley as a sleek black car skidded to a halt at the entrance. Nathaniel's driver, Maxwell. Relief crashed through him. The passenger side door flew open. "Get in," Maxwell shouted. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. He scooped the little girl into his arms and ran. The leader cursed, raising the gun. A single shot rang out. Nathaniel flinched, but he kept moving. The bullet shattered the windshield of a parked car, glass exploding onto the pavement. Nathaniel ducked low, cradling the girl against his chest as he sprinted the last few steps. He dove into the back seat, barely registering the warm leather against his rain-soaked clothes, before Maxwell slammed the gas pedal. The tires screeched. The alley disappeared behind them. Nathaniel pressed a hand against the little girl's head, keeping her close, shielding her from the chaos as the car surged forward. His pulse pounded against his ribs as he turned to look out the back window. The scared man stood in the alley, watching them go. His gun lowered. But his expression, it was calm. Unbothered. Like a man who knew this was far from over. Nathaniel clenched his jaw. They'd be coming for her again. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The ride to safety. The cars sped through the city, rain blurring the streets outside. Neon signs flashed against the wet pavement. The girl was still shaking, curled up against him, her tiny fingers tangled in his coat. Nathaniel exhaled, trying to slow the adrenaline roaring through his veins. "Sir," Maxwell said from the front, his voice tight. "Where are we going?" Nathaniel didn't hesitate. Home. Home. His world. A sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. Guarded. Secure. It was the only place that felt remotely safe right now. The little girl stirred, lifting her head slightly. Her face was pale, lips blue from the cold. "You're safe," he murmured, adjusting the coat around her to keep her warm. "No one's going to hurt you." She didn't answer. Didn't cry. Didn't speak. Just held on to him like he was the last solid thing in a collapsing world. Nathaniel swallowed hard. He wasn't good at this. Wasn't good at comforting. But he was good at protecting. And that he could do. The ride felt endless. Finally, the towering gates of his estate loomed ahead, the iron bars parting silently as the car approached. Security lights illuminated the long driveway, the mansion beyond standing like a fortress against the storm. As the car came to a halt, the front door swung open. Helen, his housekeeper, rushed out, her apron still on, her gray hair falling from its bun. Her sharp eyes swept over them both, her face etched with concern. "Oh, dear Lord." Nathaniel didn't wait. He stepped out, the girl still in his arms. She barely weighed anything. Too light, too fragile. Helen took one look at her and her expression softened. "Bring her inside." Quickly. Inside. Warmth enveloped them. Nathaniel set the girl down on the grand leather chair near the fireplace. She sank into it, still clutching his coat, her tiny form dwarfed by the massive furniture. Helen disappeared for only a moment before returning with towels and dry clothes. Nathaniel knelt beside the chair. "Let's get you warm." For the first time since he'd found her in the alley, the girl flinched at his touch. Not from cold. From fear. His stomach clenched. Helen placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Give her space," she murmured. She's been through enough. Nathaniel sat back. The girl hesitated before reaching for the towel. Her hands shook as she dried her face, the motion slow, hesitant. Helen placed a steaming cup of hot cocoa on the table beside her. Nathaniel ran a hand through his rain-soaked hair. She still hadn't spoken. He leaned forward, keeping his voice soft. "What's your name?" The girl stiffened. Then, in the smallest, quietest whisper, she answered, "Lena." Nathaniel felt something shift inside him. He didn't know what battle he'd just stepped into. Didn't know who Lena was running from. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted, they weren't taking her. Not now. Not ever. The war begins. The fire crackled softly, filling the grand sitting room with warmth, but the little girl curled in Nathaniel's oversized leather chair still shivered. Lena. That was the only thing he knew about her. Her name. Everything else was a mystery wrapped in bruises, fear, and silence. Nathaniel sat across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, watching her carefully. She hadn't moved much since he brought her in, and every now and then her tiny hands would twitch, gripping the fabric of his coat as if she was still afraid it would be taken from her. Helen, his housekeeper, knelt beside the chair, a warm towel in hand. "Sweetheart, we need to get you changed before you catch cold," she said gently. Lena's shoulders tensed. Nathaniel saw it immediately, the instinct to recoil, to expect pain. His stomach clenched. Who had done this to her? Helen didn't push, just placed the fresh set of clothes, a soft sweatshirt and fleece pajama pants, on the armrest beside her. "You can change when you're ready, love. No rush." Lena didn't respond. She just sat there, small and still, her eyes darting toward the windows, scanning the shadows outside. She was waiting. Waiting for someone to come for her. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, glancing toward the security monitor on the far wall. The mansion's cameras showed nothing unusual, but he wasn't taking chances. Not after tonight. Not after that gunshot in the alley. Nathaniel stood abruptly. "Marcus," he called. His head of security appeared almost instantly, stepping through the doorway, his expression grim. "Sir, I want men stationed at every entrance. Lock down the estate. No one comes in or out unless I say so." Marcus nodded, his dark gaze flicking toward the little girl before returning to Nathaniel. "Already done. We swept the perimeter twice. No signs of movement yet, but they'll come." Nathaniel clenched his jaw. "Let them." Helen glanced between them, lips pressed into a tight line. "What exactly are we dealing with, Mr. Kane?" Nathaniel's jaw ticked. "Human trafficking." Helen inhaled sharply. Marcus spoke first. "We ran a check on that alley. No cameras, no street surveillance, no recent police activity. Whoever those men were, they operate in the shadows." He hesitated, but they knew where to find her. Nathaniel's stomach turned. That was the real problem. They hadn't stumbled across Lena by accident. They were looking for her, which meant they weren't just some random thugs. This was organized, controlled. Lena had been owned. And now they wanted her back. Nathaniel's hands curled into fists. "I want every resource at our disposal tracking them down. I want names, locations, financial ties. If they have a network, I want to tear it apart." Marcus nodded. "Understood." He hesitated. "But, sir, this won't be clean. If we go after them, they'll retaliate. This isn't the stock market. These men don't send cease and desist letters." Nathaniel met his gaze. "I don't care. Because this wasn't just business. This was Lena. And he wasn't letting her go." A voice in the dark. The mansion was silent. The kind of silence that felt wrong. Nathaniel sat in his study, staring at the security monitors, unable to sleep. His whiskey sat untouched beside him, condensation pooling on the polished mahogany desk. He should have felt safe. The estate was locked down. Guards were posted at every entrance. The perimeter was secured. But the problem wasn't the outside. It was the little girl upstairs. Because she didn't feel safe. And that meant he couldn't either. Nathaniel ran a hand down his face, exhaustion pressing at the edges of his mind. The board of Kane Enterprises was expecting him in the morning, expecting reports, expecting results. But right now, his world wasn't billions of dollars and hostile takeovers. It was a 6-year-old girl who still hadn't changed out of her wet clothes. He pushed up from his chair and left the study, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet as he climbed the staircase. The hallway was dimly lit. Lena's door was slightly ajar. Nathaniel hesitated, then knocked lightly before stepping inside. She was curled up in bed, but her eyes were open, wide and unblinking, staring at the window. Watching. Waiting. She flinched when he stepped closer. "It's just me," Nathaniel said quietly, keeping his voice low, calm. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him. Nathaniel exhaled and slowly lowered himself onto the edge of the armchair near her bed. "I couldn't sleep either," he admitted. Lena stayed silent. But after a long pause, so quiet he almost missed it, her small voice finally came. "They always come back." Nathaniel's chest tightened. "Who?" he asked carefully. Lena curled her arms around herself, pulling the blankets higher. "The men." Nathaniel clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "Not this time." He kept his voice steady. "They're not coming here." Lena didn't respond. She didn't believe him. And why would she? The only life she'd ever known was one where the bad men always came back, where hiding never worked, where running never worked, where safety wasn't real. Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice low but firm. "I'm not them, Lena." She looked at him then. Finally, her eyes searched his face, looking for lies, looking for weakness. He gave her neither. "I don't lose," he said, "and I don't let anyone take what's mine." Lena's lips parted slightly, her small fingers twisting in the blanket. Something flickered in her gaze. Not trust. Not yet. But something. A tiny, fragile spark. A possibility. Nathaniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. This was going to take time. Time he didn't have. Because Marcus was right. The men were coming. And when they did, he'd be ready. The warning. The next morning, the mansion's iron gates stood tall against the rising sun, the estate bathed in golden light. Nathaniel stood at the entrance, drinking his coffee, watching the guards rotate shifts. The night had been quiet. Too quiet. A black car pulled up to the gate. Not his car. Not one of his men. Marcus stepped beside him, hand resting on his concealed weapon. Unknown vehicle. Nathaniel didn't move. The driver's window lowered, revealing a man in his late 40s, dressed in a sleek suit. His eyes were sharp, too sharp, the kind that had seen things no one should see and survived anyway. Nathaniel set his coffee down. "I take it you're not lost," he said. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You're making this difficult, Mr. Kane." Nathaniel's fingers twitched at his sides. The man glanced toward the mansion, then back at Nathaniel. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Nathaniel's blood ran cold. The man's smile widened. A business card slipped through the window, fluttering to the pavement. A name, a number, and 4 words typed in cold, bold letters. "Give her back, or else." Nathaniel clenched his jaw as the car drove off. Then, slowly, he reached down, picked up the card, and tore it in half. "The war comes home." Nathaniel Kane stood in the grand foyer of his estate, staring at the torn halves of the business card in his hands. "Give her back, or else." The words weren't a threat. They were a promise. The men who had taken Lena before weren't just street thugs. They were professionals. Organized. Patient. The kind of people who didn't make empty threats. And now, Now, they knew exactly where she was. Nathaniel clenched his jaw, his mind already racing through possibilities. They'd tried to take her in the alley. That hadn't worked. They'd left him a warning, a polite request for surrender. That meant the next move wouldn't be so subtle. They were coming, and he would be ready. The safe house becomes a battlefield. Nathaniel had spent years turning his estate into an impenetrable fortress. It wasn't just a home. It was a stronghold. He had the resources, the security, the power. And yet, as he stood at the top of the grand staircase, looking down at Lena curled up on the couch, he felt something new, something unexpected. Fear, not for himself, for her. She sat there, knees tucked under her oversized sweater, hands clutching the stuffed bear he'd given her. She was watching the windows, always watching, waiting. She knew better than to believe in safety. Nathaniel took a slow breath and walked down the steps, his shoes making barely a sound against the polished wood. He crouched beside the couch, leveling his gaze with hers. "They won't take you," he said. Lena didn't answer. She just curled in on herself, fingers twisting in the bear's fur. Nathaniel exhaled, his voice softer this time. "Lena, I need you to trust me." Her small fingers twitched. She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for something. A lie, a weakness, something to prove that the world worked the way she thought it did, that people always left, that promises always broke. But Nathaniel Kane didn't break. Not in the boardroom, not in war, and not when it came to her. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Nathaniel reached out, careful, slow. He rested a hand over her tiny fingers, warm and steady. "I promise." Lena swallowed hard. And finally, she nodded. The watchers in the dark. By nightfall, Nathaniel had doubled the security detail. Every window, every entry point, every blind spot, covered. Marcus oversaw the operation with military efficiency, his radio crackling as he coordinated the teams. "No movement so far," he reported, standing beside Nathaniel in the security room. The monitors flickered with live feeds of the estate's perimeter. Nathaniel exhaled. "That doesn't mean they aren't here." Marcus nodded grimly. "No, it means they're watching." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. He had spent his life navigating the shadows of power, dealing with men who thought themselves untouchable. But this was different. This wasn't just business. This was a war for a little girl's life. And there was no deal to be made. "Show me the feeds from the back road," Nathaniel ordered. Marcus switched the display, revealing the quiet stretch of pavement that ran behind the estate. The thick tree line provided natural cover, but Nathaniel had installed cameras every 50 feet. One by one, the feeds flickered through the screens. Empty, empty. Then, a shadow moved. Nathaniel stiffened. Marcus zoomed in. At first, it was nothing. Just the shifting of branches in the wind. Then, eyes. A pair of dark, watching eyes, barely visible in the tree line. Not a deer. Not an accident. Nathaniel's blood went cold. "They're here," he murmured. Marcus didn't hesitate. "I'll mobilize the teams." "No." Nathaniel's voice was firm. "We don't spook them. We let them think they still have the advantage." Marcus frowned. "Sir?" Nathaniel's expression was stone. "We make them come to us. The trap is set." Nathaniel's plan was simple. Let them think they were undetected. Let them get close. Let them believe, just for a moment, that they were winning. Then end it. Lena had fallen asleep in the living room, her small body curled into the blanket Helen had draped over her. Nathaniel stood at the window, watching the darkness, waiting. Then, just past 2 a.m., it happened. A motion sensor tripped. Not by accident. Nathaniel barely breathed as he watched the screen. 2 men, dressed in black, moving silently along the side of the house. They thought they were unseen. They were wrong. Nathaniel turned to Marcus. Now. Within seconds, security teams were moving into position. The estate remained dark, quiet, no alarms, no sirens. Not yet. Let them feel safe. The men reached the side entrance, crouching low. One of them pulled out a small device, an electronic jammer. Nathaniel's lips curled into a cold smile. They were professionals, but not as professional as him. The second they activated the jammer, they sealed their fate. Marcus gave the signal. Floodlights exploded to life, blinding white light flooding the estate grounds. Shouts erupted. The two intruders scrambled, but it was too late. Nathaniel stepped onto the front balcony as his security team swarmed them. Take them alive, he ordered. One tried to run. A single warning shot into the air made him drop to his knees. The other just stared at Nathaniel and smiled. That was the moment Nathaniel knew this wasn't over. Not even close. Because these weren't just hired men. They weren't common thugs. They were bait. The real threat was still out there. And they were coming. For Lena. For him. For everything. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on the balcony railing. He had made many enemies in his life, but none that had ever made the mistake of threatening someone he cared about. Nathaniel Kane wasn't just going to stop them. He was going to erase them. One by one. No more warnings. The night was far from over. The two intruders knelt on the gravel driveway, their hands zip-tied behind their backs, security floodlights casting long shadows behind them. Rain dripped from their soaked black clothing, their breaths heavy in the cold air. Nathaniel Kane stood over them, silent, waiting. Marcus knelt beside one of them, checking the pockets of his tactical vest. Standard issue gear, he muttered, pulling out a small black device. He turned it over in his hand. Encrypted comms. They weren't just scouting. They were reporting. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The man in front of him, dark-haired, lean, the type of muscle used for quiet jobs, lifted his head, a smirk tugging at the corner of his split lip. "You think this changes anything?" he asked. His voice was hoarse from the struggle, but there was no fear in it. "You think you've won?" Nathaniel didn't respond. He simply crouched, leveling his gaze with the man's. "Who sent you?" he asked calmly. The man laughed. Actually laughed. "You already know." Nathaniel didn't move. He just watched him, his expression unreadable. A tactic he had perfected over years of boardroom negotiations. Silence. Let the enemy speak first. The man's smirk twitched slightly. Then he leaned forward, voice dropping. "She doesn't belong to you, Kane." Nathaniel's blood ran ice cold. They weren't just trying to take Lena. They were trying to reclaim her. "She's just a kid," Nathaniel said, voice steady. "She's our kid." The man's grin widened. "And you? You're just a very expensive inconvenience." Nathaniel's patience snapped. Before Marcus could react, Nathaniel grabbed the man's collar and yanked him up. The zip ties around his wrists strained, his smirk slipping just slightly. "Who do you work for?" Nathaniel's voice was a razor's edge. The man chuckled, but there was a flicker of unease behind his eyes now. "You're a businessman," he said. "You know how these things work." He tilted his head, his grin turning almost pitying. "You're playing in the wrong league, Kane. You think money makes you powerful." Nathaniel's grip tightened. "Money doesn't keep people like us away," the man whispered. "And neither will your security. You can build all the walls you want, but we'll always get in." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Then, without warning, he slammed the man's head into the ground. The sickening crack of impact echoed through the night. Marcus swore under his breath. "Sir." Nathaniel stood, his breathing even. The man groaned, blood dripping from his nose. The smirk was gone now. Nathaniel adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, calm, in control. Then he looked down at the second intruder. "You have one chance," Nathaniel said flatly. "Tell me everything. or I let Marcus handle this conversation. The second man, a younger guy, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of hardened look that said he'd grown up in this life, remained silent. But his jaw was clenched. Nathaniel exchanged a look with Marcus. Marcus cracked his knuckles. "Let's take a walk," he muttered, grabbing the guy by his collar and hauling him toward the back of the property. Nathaniel turned back to the first man, who was still trying to shake off the impact. "This is how this ends," Nathaniel said quietly. "You tell them to stay away." The man spat blood onto the ground. Nathaniel leaned closer, his voice so soft it barely carried over the rain. "Or I burn them to the ground." The man's smirk returned, even through his busted lip. "You don't even know who they are." Nathaniel smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "I will." And then they would never come near Lena again. Inside the walls, Nathaniel returned to the house just after 4 a.m. Helen was waiting in the foyer, her hands twisting in her apron. She didn't ask what had happened outside. She already knew better. She woke up, she murmured. Didn't say anything. Just sat by the window. Nathaniel exhaled. "Is she still awake?" Helen hesitated. "She's waiting for you." Nathaniel nodded. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, pushing open Lena's bedroom door without hesitation. She was sitting on the window seat, knees tucked to her chest, staring out into the night. The moment she saw him, she straightened. "Are they gone?" she asked softly. Nathaniel didn't lie. "For now." Lena's hands gripped the fabric of her sweater. "They always come back." Nathaniel's throat tightened. Not this time. He crossed the room and knelt beside her, his voice calm. "I need you to trust me, Lena." She looked at him, really looked at him, those dark eyes searching his face. Nathaniel held her gaze. "No one is taking you." Silence. Then, a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. It wasn't full trust. Not yet. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. Because tomorrow, the real war would begin. And Nathaniel Kane wasn't just going to fight. He was going to win. Blood in the water. The morning after the attack, Nathaniel Kane was a man at war. Not with the stock market. Not with corporate rivals. But with men who operated in the dark, who had spent their lives taking what they wanted and leaving no trace behind. Men who thought they were untouchable. They had made a mistake. They had come after something Nathaniel had claimed as his own. And now he was going to burn them down. The boardroom turns into a war room. Nathaniel sat at the head of the conference table in his private office, his fingers steepled as he listened to Marcus deliver the latest intel. "The men we caught last night aren't talking," Marcus said. "But we cracked the encrypted comms. They were reporting back to someone named Vance Holloway." Nathaniel's eyes darkened. He knew that name. A high-level trafficker who had evaded authorities for over a decade. He didn't operate on street corners. He operated at the top, orchestrating deals in private rooms where security cameras didn't exist. He was the kind of man who didn't just take children. He sold them. Nathaniel clenched his fists beneath the table. Marcus continued, his voice calm but lethal. "Holloway's got connections. Judges, politicians, high-ranking law enforcement. He's insulated." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Not from me." Laura Kensington, his legal counsel, folded her arms. "This is dangerous, Nathaniel. We're not talking about boardroom games anymore. Holloway isn't going to threaten you with lawsuits. He's going to try to make you disappear." Nathaniel leaned forward. "Then he'll fail." Laura exhaled sharply. "Nathaniel." "No." His voice was steel. "They came onto my property. They tried to take her." He turned his gaze to Marcus. "Where is Holloway now?" Marcus slid a folder across the table. "We tracked his operations to 3 locations in the city. A warehouse near the docks, a club fronting as a private venue for high-profile clients, and a townhouse in the West End. We don't know where he is at the moment, but those 3 places, That's where his people operate. Nathaniel picked up the folder, flipping through the surveillance photos. Every face, every detail. He memorized them. Then he closed the file. Burned them all. Marcus lifted an eyebrow. Sir, Nathaniel met his gaze. I want his operation shut down before sundown. Laura slammed her hands on the table. Nathaniel, you can't just declare war on a human trafficking ring. He didn't flinch. Watch me. Laura rubbed her temples. Do you even hear yourself? This isn't a hostile takeover. This is a criminal empire. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, deadlier. They took Lena. Laura hesitated. Nathaniel's gaze was steady. Tell me, Laura, if it were your daughter, what would you do? Silence. Then, Laura sat back in her chair. She didn't argue anymore. Because she knew the truth. There was no justice in waiting. There was only action. And Nathaniel had never lost a battle in his life. The first strike. By sundown, Nathaniel's men moved. The warehouse was first. A financial audit had the property frozen in red tape, law enforcement descending with a search warrant on fabricated drug charges. By the time Holloway's men realized what was happening, the entire building was seized. The club was next. Marcus's team didn't wait for legal action. They went in hard, silent, efficient, eliminating security before they could even pull their weapons. When the police finally arrived, they found enough evidence of trafficking and laundering to bury Holloway's business partners for life. The townhouse. Nathaniel handled that one personally. No more warnings. The townhouse was quiet. Too quiet. Nathaniel stepped through the front door, the scent of expensive cigars lingering in the air. Marcus followed behind him, gun drawn. This is a bad idea, boss. Nathaniel didn't stop. He moved through the dimly lit hallways like he belonged there. Because he did. This was his city. And Holloway had forgotten that. At the end of the hall, a man sat in a leather armchair, legs crossed, a crystal glass of whiskey in his hand. Vance Holloway. Tall, composed, untouchable. Or so he thought. Nathaniel stepped forward, taking the empty chair across from him. You're causing quite a mess, Kane, Holloway murmured, swirling his whiskey. I could have overlooked last night. A misunderstanding. But then you started meddling. He leaned back, his expression casual. Do you even know what you've stepped into? Nathaniel met his gaze evenly. I don't care. Holloway chuckled. No, because I don't think you understand what you're fighting. Nathaniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You think you're powerful, he said quietly. Holloway smirked. Nathaniel smiled back. It wasn't a nice smile. I have more money than you, Nathaniel continued. More connections. And now, his voice dropped to a whisper. Now, I have a reason. Holloway's smirk twitched. Nathaniel tilted his head. That scares you, doesn't it? Silence. Then, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Holloway's face. Good. Nathaniel stood. You have two choices. Walk away and disappear, or spend the rest of your life running from me. Holloway exhaled through his nose. You're making a mistake. Nathaniel's smile widened. So are you. Then he turned and walked away. Because Holloway's empire, it was already crumbling. Back at the estate, Nathaniel arrived home just past midnight. Lena was still awake. She sat in the living room, curled up with the stuffed bear, her dark eyes flicking toward him the second he entered. She hadn't spoken much since last night, hadn't asked what happened, but she didn't need to. She just needed one thing: reassurance. Nathaniel crossed the room and crouched in front of her. It's over, he said softly. Lena stared at him, waiting, testing. He didn't blink. And finally, her small fingers untensed against the bear's fur. It wasn't full trust. Not yet. But for the first time, she didn't flinch when he reached for her hand. Nathaniel exhaled, letting the tension in his own chest ease. Then, barely above a whisper, Lena spoke. "They never stop," she said softly. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "They do now." Lena's lips parted slightly. And for the first time, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear. Hope. Nathaniel brushed a hand through his hair, exhaustion finally creeping in. "Go to sleep, Lena," he murmured. And this time, she actually closed her eyes. Tomorrow, Nathaniel would deal with the aftermath. But tonight, Lena slept safely. The cost of war. The sun had barely risen over the Sterling estate when Nathaniel Kane received the call. Not from Marcus. Not from Laura Kensington. Not from his enemies. From the one person he hadn't expected to hear from. A woman's voice, tired, broken, but unmistakably familiar. Is she alive? Nathaniel's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? A sharp inhale on the other end. Then, in a voice raw with something he couldn't quite place. Pain, maybe even regret. The woman spoke again. "She's my daughter." Nathaniel's pulse slowed. His free hand curled into a fist against his desk. "Where are you?" A long pause. Then, quietly, "They're coming for her. And if they find me, they'll kill me too." The line went dead. Nathaniel stared at the phone in his hand, his mind racing. Lena's mother. She was alive. And she was running from the same people trying to take Lena. A mother's ghost. Nathaniel barely had time to process the call before Marcus stormed into the study. "We found Holloway." Nathaniel straightened. "Where?" Marcus tossed a folder onto the desk. "A private airfield outside the city. He's trying to leave the country." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. The pieces were falling into place. Holloway had lost his assets. His men were arrested or dead. His entire operation had been burned to the ground in less than 48 hours. And now he was running. Nathaniel picked up his phone and sent a single text to Laura Kensington. "I need full custody papers drafted immediately." A response came almost instantly. On it, Nathaniel placed the phone down, his mind already moving 3 steps ahead. Holloway was leaving. Lena's mother was running. Which meant there was one last move to make. And Nathaniel Kane never lost the final move. A name from the past. Nathaniel found Lena in the sunroom, sitting on the windowsill, bathed in morning light. She didn't flinch when he entered. That was new. She was still quiet, still careful. But the fear that had once owned her had faded, just a little. Nathaniel crouched down beside her, resting his forearms on his knees. "I got a call today." Lena's fingers tightened around the stuffed bear in her lap. Nathaniel watched her carefully. "It was your mother." Lena's breath hitched. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, "She's dead." Nathaniel frowned. "That's what they told you," he said softly. Lena's grip tightened. Nathaniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He pulled up the call log and showed it to her. "She's alive, Lena, and she's in danger." Lena's eyes locked onto the screen. Then, slowly, she looked up at him. Nathaniel kept his voice steady. "Do you want to find her?" Lena swallowed hard. Then, in a whisper, "Yes." The hunt for Holloway. The airfield was quiet when Nathaniel and Marcus arrived. Too quiet. A private jet sat on the tarmac, its engines already running. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. He's getting ready to leave. Marcus pulled out his gun. "We're shutting it down." Nathaniel didn't hesitate. They moved fast. By the time they reached the jet, Holloway was already stepping up the stairs, a duffel bag in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Nathaniel didn't slow. He grabbed Holloway by the collar and yanked him back down the steps. The cigarette hit the pavement. Holloway barely had time to react before Nathaniel slammed him against the side of the plane. "You don't get to run." Holloway laughed. Even beaten, even on the brink of losing everything, he still had that smug smirk on his face. "You think this is over?" Nathaniel pressed his forearm into Holloway's throat. "Oh, it's over," Nathaniel said. "You just haven't accepted it yet." Holloway's smirk didn't falter. Then he whispered something, a single name, and Nathaniel's world stopped. "You really don't know what you're dealing with," Holloway murmured, voice raspy. Nathaniel's grip tightened. "What did you say?" Holloway grinned, his bloody lip curling. "You can kill me, Kane, but she'll never be safe." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. Then he pulled back, just slightly. He didn't need to kill Holloway, because this wasn't about him anymore. This was about who was above him. A bigger monster. Nathaniel left Holloway in the hands of the authorities. He had bigger problems now. Holloway had been a player, but someone else was pulling the strings. Someone bigger. And if that person was still out there, then Lena wasn't safe. Not yet. The final choice. Nathaniel returned home to find Lena still sitting in the sunroom, waiting. He sat beside her, resting his back against the window. Lena didn't look at him. "You found him," she said quietly. Nathaniel nodded. "He's gone." Lena's fingers curled around the bear's ear. Silence. Then, "I don't want to go back." Nathaniel turned toward her. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was just staring out at the trees. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "You don't have to." Lena turned to him, her dark eyes searching his face. Nathaniel met her gaze. "I meant what I said, Lena." His voice was soft, firm. "You're safe here." Lena's small fingers twitched. Then, slowly, she reached out. Not for the bear. Not to pull away. For him. Her tiny fingers wrapped around his. And for the first time since the alley, Nathaniel Kane felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Something more than rage. More than vengeance. Purpose. Lena squeezed his hand. Nathaniel squeezed back. The war wasn't over. Not yet. But now she wasn't fighting alone. And neither was he.